For folks who don't know me, I'm Hillary Hayden. I'm the organizing director at the Trade Justice Education Fund, and we're a national organization working to stop the damage of corporate-centered trade deals and promote a positive vision for international trade. These Trade Justice Power Hour calls happen every third Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern and cover a wide range of educational topics about trade policy that will be relevant and interesting to activists across the country. I do want to flag quickly that these calls are not intended as press briefings. So if you're a member of the press and you have questions, I would love to talk to you, but this is not the place for that. So please reach out to me separately. This month, we're going to discuss a major new trade attack that has been leveled against the most significant climate legislation ever passed in the United States. First, we're going to hear from Melinda St. of Public Citizens Global Trade Watch about the new World Trade Organization challenge against the clean energy provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act. Provisions that are desperately needed to both reduce climate pollution and create good-paying manufacturing jobs in renewable energy. Then we're going to hear from my colleague at Trade Justice, Arthur Stamoulis, about what you can do to help convince officials to reject the WTO case against the IRA and help prevent future trade attacks on climate measures. And then finally, we're going to hear briefly from Mary Ann Comfort of Sisters of Mercy about a new set of principles that the faith community has published that would help ensure trade in critical minerals needed for clean energy technologies is more just and sustainable. It is a really full agenda today, but we will have time for questions after Melinda's presentation and then toward the end of the call after Marian's presentation. So please put those questions in the chat as we go, and we're going to get to as many of those as we can. So I want to jump in with a quick introduction of Melinda. A longtime leader in the trade justice movement and one of Trade Justice Education Fund's closest allies, Melinda St. is the director of Public Citizens Global Trade Watch. Before that, she was policy director of Jubilee USA Network and the executive director of Witness for Peace, which are two other close friends in the trade justice movement. Melinda, I want to thank you so much for being here. Please tell us what we need to know about the Inflation Reduction Act and this trade attack against it.
Thank you so much, Hillary, and it's great to be here with all of you. Thank you so much for joining. So today, I would like to give some background about the Inflation Reduction Act for those of you who may not be deeply steeped in this important legislation, and what led us to this current state of affairs where, as Hillary mentioned, outdated WTO rules are being weaponized against climate action. So, I mean, I'm sure many of you know, it's no secret that the U.S. is way behind where we need to be with respect to the urgency of climate change. We still have many elected leaders who claim that climate change is a hoax. We know that Trump withdrew from the already 2-week Paris climate agreement during his presidency, and the fossil fuel lobby has stymied even modest climate action again and again. And because the US is one of the world's greatest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, it's absolutely critical that we get our act together, right? Or there's no way the world will be able to meet greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets that science demands. And after years of activism by climate activists and allies, they've pushed the idea of a Green New Deal, which would involve massive investments in a clean energy transformation. And while we're still very, very far from that vision, the Biden administration did incorporate elements of the Green New Deal in a proposal early in the administration called Build Back Better. That was early in the president's term. And I don't know if folks remember, but the Build Back Better was initially intended to be several $1 trillion in investment in climate, healthcare, immigration, the care economy, and more. But because Republicans were not willing to support any climate legislation, the only mechanism in the Senate that allowed for a simple majority to pass legislation was a process called budget reconciliation. And what that means is that the legislation had to be only about spending. So any piece of it that was deemed more of kind of changing policy more than spending, like what the government is spending, could be removed from the bill. So everything that had to do with policy had to be crafted through how the government spends money. And the reason that's so they were pushing this Build Back Better initiative that included a lot of elements of the Green New Deal. But there were two conservative Democratic senators, Joe Manchin from West Virginia, heavily influenced by the coal industry, and Kirsten Sinema from Arizona, who used their leverage to delay and water down and ultimately kill the Build Back Better initiative. But then, fortunately, there was many activists and policymakers regrouped and pushed the policy through in various pieces to try to move them over the finish line. So first there was there were a number of spending bills, the CHIPS Investments Act, and then finally the Inflation Reduction Act. So given that this bill, as I mentioned, had to be entirely about spending, even though this is, climate legislation, it was about investing our tax dollars. And so if we're going to be investing billions of dollars in tax dollars, having a portion of those dollars designated to support domestic manufacturing was critical, and domestic jobs. And of course, to get this fragile piece of legislation over the finish line with Manchin and Sinema was nearly impossible. I mean, those of us who were following the Build Back Better process barely dared to believe that the IRA would make it through at all. Manchin would, make a deal on what he would support, and then they'd change the bill, and then he'd move the goalposts. I mean, I'm originally from West Virginia, and so I joined a group of West Virginia kayaktivists. Perhaps folks may remember that we paddled out to Manchin's yacht that he lives on while he's in Washington, and that video went viral as part of this, major push to try to get this legislation over the finish line. So finally, in August of 2022. The Inflation Reduction Act was passed by the Senate and House Democrats and signed into law by the president. Now, this bill was far from perfect. It's far from what is needed, but it's by far the most sweeping piece of climate legislation the United States has ever passed. And it represents a really important shift. The US recognizing the need to use government spending to boost demand, that the free market isn't enough to support good jobs and the transition of the economy at the scale that's needed. So after decades of doing virtually nothing to meet our Paris climate commitments, this law could reduce emissions up to 42% by 2030. And it estimates that 5 million clean energy jobs and 900,000 clean manufacturing jobs would be created by this legislation. And it does so in a number of ways. It boosted demand for clean electricity manufacturing. So it includes clean electricity tax credits worth more than $127 billion. And they each established for the first time a bonus 10% tax credit for projects that use domestically manufactured materials and parts. So to qualify for this special bonus of tax credits, the developers must use domestically made iron and steel and manufactured components, in which the US production accounts for roughly half of the value. So that was one piece. And then it also stimulated demand for clean vehicle manufacturing or electric vehicles. The law includes a tax credit for new clean vehicles with a credit reduce the cost of new EVs, electric vehicles, by up to $7,500 and also incentivizing the establishment of a complete and resilient supply chain for EV battery components in North America. It ensures that critical minerals that comprise these batteries are not sourced from countries relying on child and forced labor, or countries where supply chain bottlenecks and disruptions have threatened the EV transition. It included a tax credit on critical minerals that says that these minerals must be sourced from the US or countries that the United States has a free trade agreement with, or they need to invest their own resources in North American mining and battery recycling capacities. Again, with the goal of boosting US jobs and directing mineral sourcing away from countries that the United States does not feel comfortable with, namely China. So here's where the WTO and the trade threats come into the story. Before the ink was dry on the Inflation Reduction Act, the EU, the UK, South Korea, Japan, and others started threatening to use outdated trade rules to challenge the policy. They were arguing that the structure of the tax credits, particularly the domestic content and friendshoring requirements, violate the rules at the WTO that were written long before any government was taking climate change seriously. Prominent labor, environmental, and consumer groups, including the United Auto Workers, Steel Workers, Sierra Club, and Public Citizen, urged the U.S. government to boldly implement the IRA as intended, despite these trade pact attacks, and to make a commitment to not use such trade rules to challenge other countries' policies. The Biden administration did implement the IRA, but also has since bent over backwards to appease some of the trading partners, going so far as to quickly negotiate a critical minerals agreement that they called with Japan, that they claim qualifies it as a free trade agreement for the purposes of the EV tax credits under the IRA for minerals sourced or processed in Japan. And they began negotiating other such agreements with the EU, the UK, and even preliminary discussions with resource-rich countries like Indonesia and the Philippines, where there are heinous abuses in the supply chain. This angered many people in Congress who said that these creative interpretations of the law undermine their intent and bypass Congress's authority on trade agreements. And so then in March of this year, 2024, the People's Republic of China followed through on its threat and officially filed a complaint against the US at the WTO, alleging that the IRA's requirements to qualify for the tax credits are discriminatory. And at the WTO, trade concerns are considered more important than any other goal, including taking climate action. So for a WTO tribunal, the fact that the law is the most consequential climate bill to ever pass in the United States is irrelevant if they decide that the structure of the IRA's incentives violate the trade rules. So what does this mean? In other past rulings, for instance, the WTO ruled against the US a number of times over our dolphin-safe tuna labeling or country of origin labeling for meat, saying that those labels were discriminatory, that those were policies meant to allow consumers to choose products that they considered to be safer or protecting the environment. That didn't matter. The US had to change our laws to comply with those outrageous WTO rulings, and many other countries have been forced to change important public interest policies to comply with WTO rulings. The tribunals often rule that if there was basically any less trade restrictive policy that a government could have taken to achieve the goal, then they're in violation of the rules. But of course, that's not how policymaking works. Sometimes, like with the IRA, you have to build political coalitions to pass legislation. And if you're spending US taxpayer money on subsidies, it's only logical that policymakers would want some of the jobs created by those investments to be created locally. And so the logic of the WTO is completely backwards, particularly given the climate imperative. Trade concerns should not take precedent over climate measures. Climate concerns should take precedent over trade measures. And so, as I think Arthur will mention, the USTR has a comment period open right now. It'll be important for them to hear from constituents that they should not back down from the implementation of the IRA, despite regardless of any WTO case. And that importantly, the US should also commit to refrain from challenging other countries' policies, climate policies. So I'll leave it there. Happy to answer any questions. And thanks again for having me.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Melinda. I think that was really helpful background for folks. I do want to remind folks to put questions for Melinda in the Q&A feature, and we're going to get to as many of those as we can. Melinda, we're going to take questions for you right now because I know that you have to jump. So one question that someone messaged to me while you were speaking is that a lot of folks in the climate space say things like that we've never lost an ISDS case, I think is what this is alluding to. We've never lost an ISDS case. We talked about that with the Keystone Pipeline, but we have lost these other cases in these other spaces. Can you talk a little bit about the differences between those two systems?
Yes, good question. The ISDS system is where a foreign corporation can sue a government outside of the court system, in an ISTS tribunals to challenge policies that they claim violate their rights under the trade agreement. What I'm referring to at the WTO, there is not investor-to-state dispute settlement. There is what's called state-to-state dispute settlement. So that is a government sues another government, usually on behalf of the affected industry from that country at the WTO. And so the U.S. has lost cases at the WTO. As I mentioned, there was a long time, environmental activist policy and conservation policy to protect dolphins in the way that tuna is harvested. There was dolphin-safe tuna labeling was well, first there was an attempt to ban the harvesting tuna if it killed dolphins. That was considered to be a violation because it was Mexico and there were some other countries that sued the U.S. because they said that the fleets that that they were their fishing fleets used a process that killed dolphins, and so therefore if we had this label and consumers were able to decide to choose not to do that, that would be quote unquote discriminatory. So again, if there was nothing about it that was supposed to be like we're discriminating against these other countries, but we do want our consumers to be able to discriminate against a product that kills dolphins. Similarly, like with country of origin labeling of meat, to be able even to know where your meat comes from, that was considered by a WTO tribunal to be a violation because basically what the argument was, I mean, and it's kind of, it defies common sense, right? I mean, you think that you're thinking about, okay, what should be discrimination? That's if you're like intentionally trying to discriminate against the products from another country. But if you have a policy that has a public interest goal and it de facto discriminates because consumers just don't want to purchase that or whatever, then that is considered to be at the WTO, because of the logic of the WTO, that if you were to come up with any other policy that would be less trade restrictive, that's what you need to do. And we've been arguing for years that is not the right standard, and particularly now when we're talking about the climate emergency, thinking about forcing governments to be like, the only way you can take climate action is to do something that will have absolutely no impact on imports from other countries. It's just simply not realistic. And as I mentioned with the IRA, these are taxpayer subsidies. We're not banning the imports of these of electric vehicles from other countries. We're simply saying that if you're going to get taxpayer funded subsidies, that we want some of that money to benefit in the United States or benefit our friends and so forth. So that's kind of where and I would also just say even when it comes to the U.S. not losing a case on the ISDS front, we always will, I always think that it's really important to note that a country never wins. They may maybe not have to pay in one particular case, but it's the corporations that can challenge policies. They still have to spend years defending themselves. For the country like the United States, we have the resources sometimes to be able to do that. For developing countries, for poorer countries, that can completely bankrupt the country. So ISDS we think should be completely eliminated. And then when it comes to the state-to-state dispute settlement, we really need to take seriously the fact that countries need to be taking our climate emergency seriously and and responding and not subsuming those concerns to these the outdated rules at the WTO.
Thank you so much. That's super helpful. I have one more question for you. Given the U.S., like the amount of power that the U.S. has at the WTO, is there a fast way? I have a gut feeling about the answer to this question, but is there a fast way that any of these WTO rules could ever actually change to incorporate more environmental rules or more human rights considerations?
Well, I wish the answer could be yes, but I think perhaps some of the folks on this call, and I know, Trade Justice has been really active, probably remembered that we fought for, after the COVID pandemic, there was an effort to make the tiniest of changes to not even changes, but actually a simple waiver of WTO rules on intellectual property to allow for countries to be able to rapidly deploy and create generic versions of vaccines, which it just should have been it should have been the easiest thing to do, to just have a simple waiver, because the entire globe needed these vaccines to be deployed, not just for humanitarian reasons, but for economic reasons, so that the virus wouldn't continue to mutate and so forth. And the WTO could not do it. It was extremely slow. In the end, what they ended up agreeing to after years of negotiation of something that should have been so simple, were they were not able to make any meaningful waiver for this, which is an enormous failure of the institution. So I think, if that's what happens when we're thinking about trying to change the tiniest things during a global pandemic that affected every single country, and it was in the rich country's interest to make changes, they were not willing to do that because of the lobby from big pharmaceutical companies. And I think similarly we have the same problem. I mean, many of the rules of the WTO were written by basically by and for fossil fuel companies. They were very much a part of these rules that were written in the 90s, again, before climate change was being taken seriously. And even if there are governments that are interested in taking action, we have not seen the WTO as an institution, and the way the membership works, and to be able to make the kinds of changes to the rules that we need. But we need to fight hard to do that. But I think, as Arthur will mention, in the meantime, because of this emergency, we have got to have a moratorium on these kinds of challenges. This isn't just the IRA isn't the first climate policy to be challenged. I mean, actually, the U.S. challenged India for its domestic content requirements for deploying solar energy, and then China went ahead and challenged the United States, basically a tit for tat. So having this kind of crazy back and forth, let's challenge each other's climate policies, makes no sense. Fortunately, those cases were dropped by the decision by the U.S. and India to drop those cases. But this is a serious problem, and I think what this current case really just highlights just how important it is for us to do that.
That's such a helpful answer. I think we get asked that question a lot. Like, how can we change the rules? And it's like, like you said, it's like a really long process, but it doesn't mean that we should give up on that. Melinda, I want to thank you so much for coming, for outlining this case for us. We really appreciate you making time. I know you're on the road, and just really appreciate you joining and sharing about this.
No, thank you. It's great. Thanks to all of you. Feel free to share my email, and we're happy to answer any questions that come up.
Thanks so much, Melinda. So I want to note for folks here that we do have an opportunity to stop this trade attack on the Inflation Reduction Act, and if we push back hard enough to potentially stop future trade attacks on climate action. So to discuss where we go from here, I want to turn things over to my colleague, Arthur Stamoulis, who's the Executive Director at the Trade Justice Education Fund. Arthur?
Yeah, thanks, Hillary, and hello, everybody. Appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. So as Melinda just explained, these outdated corporate-driven trade rules are being used to undermine desperately needed climate measures, to undermine desperately needed clean energy jobs programs, and it's really on our shoulders to push back. So right now, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative has an open public comment period specifically about the WTO challenge against the IRA. And we're urging each of you to please sign on to short and sweet joint comments that Trade Justice and Global Trade Watch put together that urge public officials to firmly reject that WTO challenge. We want to make sure they don't weaken the IRA in any of the ways that are being demanded in this WTO suit. So this public comment period is our chance to weigh in with officials and urge them not to crumble in the face of this particular trade attack. But to us, defending the IRA from this one specific attack is just the minimum. We not only need to protect the IRA's clean energy provisions in this instance, but we need to stop trade deals from being used to attack climate and clean energy measures moving forward, both here in the US and everywhere else around the world. People don't often recognize the impact that these trade challenges have and the role they're playing in delaying climate action. Melinda touched on this. Like, even if a country doesn't lose a WTO case directly, And for the record, most WTO challenges that are brought are successful. Countries do lose. The US has lost WTO cases related to the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, a host of other policies. A single lost case can lead to the imposition of penalties worth billions of dollars each year. So even powerful countries like the US change their laws to avoid that. But even before a country loses a case, the threat of these trade challenges has a significant chilling effect. Governments spend literally years trying to tweak their policy proposals in the hopes of avoiding a trade challenge. And when it comes to the climate crisis, we don't have years to waste playing those games. And not only that, but as governments make those tweaks to their climate proposals, hoping to avoid trade challenges, as you might expect, each tweak is generally a weakening of the original proposal. It's never making the policy stronger. And for smaller, less affluent countries, even the mere threat of a potential trade challenge is often enough to get them to back off altogether. And so whether these trade attacks are derailing climate policies entirely, or weakening them, or delaying them, any of that is unacceptable. And that's something we need to end. And the fastest, easiest, most direct way to end trade attacks and clean energy programs and other climate policies is with something called a climate peace clause. A climate peace clause is an agreement between governments to impose a moratorium on the use of trade and investment rules to attack one another's clean energy and other climate policies. And the main benefits of a climate peace clause are threefold. First, it would bring an immediate end to trade attacks on existing climate measures. Second, it would allow governments to consider and adopt new climate and clean energy transition measures without the fear of costly trade challenges, meaning more climate action, stronger climate action, faster climate action. And third, it would create both the time and the incentive for governments to work together on the longer term project of rewriting global trade rules so that they benefit rather than undermine environmental stability. You know, in a perfect world, we would go straight to that third step, get rid of all the damaging corporate rigged rules that harm the planet, that harm working families, and we would replace them with entirely new rules that are beneficial. But as Melinda just said, those of us who've worked on trade for a while know that's easier said than done. And in my notes, I went right to that TRIPS waiver example as well. In the midst of a global pandemic that killed millions of people, that cost trillions of dollars of economic damage, that even inconvenienced the rich and powerful, governments couldn't reach an agreement to temporarily waive trade rule monopoly protections for the pharmaceutical industry, which is what was needed for the world to more quickly produce vaccines, test kits, and treatments. That was a very limited ask, temporarily pausing small parts of one specific trade pact. Overhauling the entirety of existing trade rules, which is pretty much what's needed in the climate context, that's going to be a longer term endeavor. It's not just one section of the TRIPS agreement we need to fix when it comes to climate change. There's this whole spaghetti bowl of trade agreement acronyms that interfere with policies aimed at subsidizing renewable energy, banning carbon intensive or energy inefficient products or services, or even just prioritizing the import of goods made with low embedded emissions. And not only do we need to get those bad agreements out of the way to do those things, but there's a whole host of new policies that we would want to add to actively promote renewable energy, to promote energy efficiency, to ensure more just and sustainable development throughout the globe. So groups like Trade Justice, like Global Trade Watch, we're set up to carry out that work over the long haul. We are doing that work, but with climate change, we don't have a minute to waste. We need that immediate moratorium on using these broken trade rules to attack climate action while we do the longer term work of rewriting the rules entirely. And so when you look at the submission we put together, urging officials to reject the WTO case against the IRA, you'll see we also ask officials to do more and to get to work now on a climate peace clause so that we can head off additional attacks like this into the future. There are a lot more technical details on the climate peace clause that I'm happy to get into during the discussion if folks are interested. I'm also going to ask that my colleagues please paste links in the chat to our two-page fact sheet on the climate peace clause and a longer paper that we co-published with the Sierra Club on the case for and design of a climate peace clause. We can send links around in the follow-up email too. But in the meantime, the bottom line here is we just can't let outdated corporate-driven trade rules, many of which were agreed to long before governments started taking climate action seriously, to be used to derail, weaken, and delay needed climate policies and clean jobs policies. And a climate peace clause is our quickest way of bringing a halt to trade attacks and climate action. So I urge you to please join us in calling for a climate peace clause, and signing on to the submission in the IRA case is the best way to do that today. I think I'll leave it there, Hillary. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Arthur. I will note for folks that are asking in the chat that I'm going to be sure that those links and a recording of this call end up in your inbox either later this afternoon or tomorrow. And then also we are going to have a couple minutes for questions for Arthur and for our final speaker in a couple minutes. So please keep putting those questions as they come up in the Q&A feature, and we're going to get to as many of those as we can. Next up, though, before we get to Q&A, we're going to hear from Marianne Comfort of the Sisters of Mercy about a set of principles that the Interreligious Working Group on Extractive Industries put together for critical minerals agreements. If you recall from one of our previous briefings, a major focus of trade negotiations these days is on securing supply chains for critical minerals like nickel, cobalt, lithium, and others that are needed for green energy technologies like long storage batteries, electric vehicles, and solar panels. To connect the dots a little bit to Melinda and Arthur's presentations, one of the ways the Biden administration has tried to prevent other governments from joining China in formally attacking the IRA at the WTO is by entering into these so-called critical minerals agreements. And in doing so, as Melinda kind of alluded to earlier, giving other countries access to the tax credits within the IRA that had been established by Congress to create good-paying clean energy manufacturing jobs in the U.S. These critical minerals agreements, or CMAs, as folks are getting used to hearing that acronym, would be a lot less urgent if a climate peace clause was in place. But insofar as CMAs do move forward, we want to be sure that they're contributing toward a just and sustainable global economy, rather than promoting the exploitative rip and ship resource extraction that's been exacerbated under previous trade deals. So, Marianne, thank you so much for joining us. Let me turn things over to you now.
Thank you so much. So glad to be here. First, I want to say that the Interreligious Working Group on Extractive Industries, we've been around for quite a number of years, educating our networks about the harms of extractive industries and doing advocacy. But we're really new to the trade space. And so really grateful for Melinda and Arthur and others who are bringing us up to speed on how important trade is and where we can make a difference in some of these policies. So we are definitely not technical experts. We are not trade experts. What we can do is really bring a moral voice to this conversation. So we have felt that as faith groups, we should come out with some principles. So when we're assessing critical mineral agreements, when we're assessing any other trade deals, when we're assessing any policies at all that Congress or the administration might be looking at around sourcing of transition minerals, that we would have a document that we could share with policymakers, that we can share with our networks around the importance of this topic, and that we can use for statements and our advocacy. So I'm going to just name some of the high level of those principles, and then I'll put in the chat the link to that so you can see that. So one of our top line asks is really around community engagement and giving communities that are located on or near proposed mining sites the opportunity to weigh in. For Indigenous communities, that's called free, prior, and informed consent. It's actually a formal mechanism written into international law that they should have this opportunity to really be not just consulted, but have this opportunity to give informed consent. And that includes the right to say no. The second principle would be that governments and companies have to implement strong and enforceable labor and environmental standards and protection of human rights throughout any mining process for these minerals and metals. Also, we want to incentivize, sorry, my phone rang. We want to incentivize looking into reuse and recycling of metals and batteries so we can minimize the amount of mining to begin with. And then, of course, when we're talking about mining, we don't want to be saying that we're looking to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by moving into these new technologies, but then we're increasing greenhouse gas emissions by mining, because mining is very intensive carbon emissions. So we want to make sure that we're minimizing those emissions in the mining process. And finally, we want to make sure that communities and consumers have accurate information about these supply chains. Like Melinda was saying, you know, we want consumers to be able to know that what's in their electric vehicles, what's in their phones, what's in the solar panels on their houses is being sourced in a fair way. And that includes, as we're hearing more and more, that when we're talking about critical minerals, that's starting to be stretched to include other so-called security measures and so we're hearing about these same minerals are being used for military purposes. And so we want to make sure that when we're talking about transition minerals, that we're talking about those explicitly being used for the very necessary energy transition and not for the military and other purposes, that there's a lot of transparency about the end use of these minerals and metals as well. And so I think I'll stop there. Just wanted to share that with you, and I'll put the link to the document in the chat.
Thank you so much, Marianne. We're going to take questions for Marianne and for Arthur in just a second. So I want to again invite folks to be putting those questions in the Q&A feature. For folks that want to learn more about critical minerals agreements, I'm going to actually ask Clayton to share a link in a second to a website that Trade Justice and many partner organizations have put together that summarizes a lot of our asks around critical minerals agreements. You're going to note when you click on that link that there's a whole bunch of organizations that have come forward and endorsed those asks. And there's also a form on there. So if your organization is not on there yet and you want to endorse those asks, please fill that form out and we will get your organization listed on that website as well. Thank you so much, Marianne, for sharing that. Marianne, one question for you. So how did the interreligious working group end up putting together these principles? What was kind of the driver of that conversation?
Sure. Well, we're in some of these conversations with Arthur, Melinda, and others talking about the environmental and social safeguards needed around this. And so we realized that we wanted to create a comparable document that our faith networks would be able to access and be able to relate to, that out of our faith, this moral call that we should be looking at sourcing these minerals in a just way. And I will say that for those of us who are Christian, we felt a particular responsibility because we know that there are centuries of decrees and policies instituted by the Christian church that kind of permitted and even encouraged the dispossession and enslavement of peoples. And so we felt a particular responsibility of speaking out and saying that we do not want to repeat colonial history around the sourcing of transition minerals and that we need to do things differently as we move forward, not go back, as the popular phrase now is in the political sphere, not go back, but go forward into a more just future.
That's super helpful. I know that so many conversations in regard to critical minerals agreements have been playing out in the national space on labor rights, on climate, on all kinds of issues. So really appreciate that. Arthur, one question for you. Are there any spaces right now where they're actively considering moving forward with climate peace clause conversations in any of the trade deals that we have? Do we have any like precedent, I guess, for this as a strategy?
Yeah, so one of the great things about a climate peace clause is that it can be implemented at a lot of different levels. Like ideally, you would have the entire globe agree at once to a climate peace clause, whether at the World Trade Organization or in some other global venue. But you know, in the interim, you could have a climate peace clause between just two countries. You could add climate peace clause provisions to other trade negotiations, to CMAs, you know, at the G7, at the TTC, APEP, IPEP, you know, a whole host of areas. I mean, it's even possible unilaterally for a country to say, hey, we're not, you know, we're putting a moratorium on the use of challenging other countries' clean energy and climate measures. So that's one of the benefits of a climate peace clause, that it can be done with a coalition of the willing right out of the gate. I will say that there are growing calls from civil society organizations around the world, you know, the US, Canada, Mexico, Europe, Africa, like all over the place for a climate peace clause. But we're really going to need to continue pressing to get that to happen. You know, this IRA case explains, I think, really clearly why it's important for the United States, why it's in the US interest to support a climate peace clause. You know, we don't want our policies challenged, weakened, undermined, and that's exactly what's happening right now. But other countries, you know, don't want their policies attacked either. And so this is really in a lot of countries' interests. It's a relatively new concept. We've been talking about it since the Biden administration came in. You know, under previous administrations, people either said climate change was a hoax, so you know there was very little hope then, or you know even during the Obama administration, you know, refused to mention climate change in trade agreements. So there's an opportunity under this administration, and you know, and hopefully moving forward to really make progress on this. But people are going to need to push.
I think that's super helpful. Another question, Arthur, for you. This question is, how many and by whom, eager to hear your response to this question, WTO cases have been raised on climate specific actions?
That's a great question. There are quite a few that have been raised specifically related to subsidization of clean energy. There have been even more that have been threatened. And you know, I don't have the exact number off the top of my head, but if you look in that report that Clayton put in the chat about the case for and design of a climate peace clause, we list a bunch of them right in there. So yeah, there are a good number. And again, the US, I mean, going back decades, has lost a WTO challenges to a whole host of environmental policies before, you know, we finally started taking climate change seriously. And now our first major climate policy, the IRA, that's being attacked. So it's been pretty consistent, unfortunately. And I think this IRA attack is sort of taking the wool off some people's eyes that, hey, wait a minute, you know, we're going to need to do more policies like this in the future. We need to stop these from being undermined by trade agreements.
Super helpful. I'm going to read a pretty lengthy question from our friends at the Pulp and Paper Workers. What about EITE, which for non-trade folks is energy intensive, trade exposed industries that are being pushed out of the country to areas like China? Carbon leakage is kind of a reality of legislation that has no teeth in countries with little or no regulation for the environment. The demand for products that the pulp and paper workers produce, and there's a handful of other industries out here in the Northwest that you know, are producing some of the cleanest materials in the world. They've done a lot to like clean up their own industry. The shifting of the carbon footprint as they outsource jobs to other countries is real and disastrous. And I just wonder, Arthur, if you have a response about how energy intensive and trade exposed industries play into this peace clause and other WTO issues?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and it ties in super, super closely. Any sort of attempt to preference the import of products that meet certain environmental standards, including, embedded emission standards, is verboten under the WTO and other trade rules. Any attempts to subsidize industry in the United States and help speed the transition to cleaner products like the pulp and paper workers are doing, is vulnerable to trade attacks. I mean, we've seen under the current administration, this massive investment in clean manufacturing in the US. We've seen under this administration new tariffs to stop unfair imports from undermining those investments. But a lot more is needed, and these trade attacks get in the way of that. And there's talk of things like CBAMs, carbon border adjustment mechanisms, to try to ensure that products, including pulp and paper, that don't meet certain environmental thresholds, either can't be brought into the U.S. or face tariffs to try to level the playing field a little bit more. And those, just that concept before any country, even opposed it, the concept has been challenged. The EU has a policy like that that's already been attacked formally within the WTO. We just need to put a moratorium on the use of these trade attacks to allow countries to really invest in, with dollars, to invest in with policies, a speeding up of cleaner industrial policy, cleaner industrialization. And that's going to be good for workers. It's going to be good for the planet. It's going to give consumers a lot more choice. But, as Melinda said, we just need to start putting those policies ahead of the outdated trade mandates.
Awesome. Thanks, Arthur. I think I got to be like really involved in some conversations around state procurement in Washington State when I was doing exclusively work there. And I think that question is it's a really important one as we figure out how to craft legislation and how we're going to manage things around climate change and that kind of thing. I want to respond quickly, and Arthur, you might say more to this, to folks that are asking if we can directly demand that the WTO stop attacking climate policies. I think that virtually every statement or letter that folks have put together since the WTO came into being has basically asked them to not attack climate policies, to not attack food policies, to not attack workers' rights related provisions. And this, is an unfortunate reality that these are the rules that we're still living under. But there's a lot of organizing that continues to happen around what we can do to stop these attacks on climate policies, through the peace clause, through other mechanisms. Arthur, do you have a lot more, you spend a lot more time in this organizing space, many more years than me. Are there other efforts that have been made to stop these attacks coming from the WTO?
Yeah, I mean, look, countries have been talking about how do we change our trade rules to just deal with the climate reality that we face now. So those conversations go on in a host of venues. I mean, almost on a daily basis, certainly a weekly basis, around the world. But as Melinda alluded, as I alluded, making change at the WTO is a long, tough, awful slog. We're going to hear a lot more in this space next year about opportunities to make changes to the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, the USMCA, the rebranded NAFTA deal. There are opportunities to advance climate goals in the APEP negotiations, the America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity, those dialogues. I think either of those and many other venues are going to get us further faster than at the WTO. And again, that's why we're calling for a moratorium on the use of trade and investment rules to attack climate measures, in the interim while that longer term work of changing the WTO rules happens. This isn't without precedent. There is a similar peace clause at the WTO around food security measures. That's an imperfect agreement, and we can go into problems with that, but it is a precedent, and one that just goes to show countries can come to this agreement that, hey, while we do the often years-long process of renegotiating the existing rules, we're not going to hold other countries to them when it comes to clean energy and climate measures.
Thanks, Arthur. So I think we're gonna leave our Q&A there. I want to thank our speakers again for joining and for sharing with us about the work that's happening in this space. I will say for folks that have been paying attention to work related to climate, to investor-state dispute settlement, to the peace clause, that there's been so many things moving in this space this year. And it's been really exciting to see that energy. I want to reiterate that we have an opportunity right now to stop the Inflation Reduction Act attack and future trade attacks on climate action. And I'll be in touch in my follow-up email with a recording of this and then links from our conversation. Thank you so much, everyone. We'll see you in October, and I'll be in touch.